The fifth lecture and category topic is on water efficiency. This category is around the fact that I suppose all of water efficiency conservation methods are centered around the idea that we wouldn't use potable water for requirements other than drinking or cooking or domestic. And at the minute, I suppose we're treating water to make it safe to drink, and then we're using it to irrigate land or to wash our hands or to flush the toilet with, and it's wasteful because just waste of that water for that purpose, but also the amount of energy and effort that goes into making it potable and then to use it for those reasons is wasteful. So this category addresses water use, looking at it holistically. So it looks at indoor water use, it looks at outdoor water use, it looks at any specialized uses, and it looks at metering. And it also looks at kind of alternative sources to do the irrigation and the flushing, etc., from non-potable sources. Version 4 of LEAD then has introduced requirements in relation to appliances and cooling towers, and it's also introduced the water metering requirements, so they weren't there in the previous version. So that translates into credits that are to do with outdoor water use reduction and indoor water use reduction, the metering, cooling tower and cooling towers and water metering. And you'll notice it's kind of split here between prerequisites and credits. So for example, with outdoor water use reduction, there is elements of that are prerequisites and so mandatory, and then there are elements that are that you can gain additional credits for. This category works in some of these credits about achieving levels of reduction beyond a baseline, so below a set baseline. So depending on how far below that you reduce the water consumption depends on the equivalent number of credits. Water usage metrics, again, is given in the manual, but it's things like litres per flush or litres per minute or litres per hour, and this category requires you to use water kind of manual and interactive water use calculators to calculate both the baseline and then your design case, so how far you've reduced that for water efficiency. And there's just a couple of concepts as well that you probably need to be familiar with. It's the difference between a flush fixture and a flow fixture. So a flush fixture is anything that works by a flush, so toilets and urinals, and their water usage therefore is measured per flush, whereas a flow fixture is anything that water flows through, so like a tap or a hose or a dishwasher, and its water usage is measured per minute typically. Another kind of term is this full-time equivalent. That's not only used in this category, but it's also used in the indoor environmental quality one and the environmental assessment. So this is FTE, full-time equivalent number, that's used to calculate the number of occupants within a building. So for example, it's based on a 40-hour work week. So if you're in the building, that occupant is in the building for 8 hours, they'd get one full-time equivalent. But if it was a part-time person, they'd have full-time equivalents based on the hours they're there per week divided by 40, for example, and that's all again in a table. But that would, depending on the number of occupants you have, that's what you use to calculate the baseline, whether it's a flow or a flush rate, to calculate what the baseline figure for that number of occupants would be. The first prerequisite is to do with outdoor water use reduction. So it's very simple. The intent and the aim is to reduce outdoor water consumption. I suppose this, again, remember this comes from the US, where I guess this is more of an issue than maybe in Ireland. We don't tend to, unless it's a public space or something, irrigate outdoor spaces, and also we don't particularly have the need to with our climate. So the first option to achieve the requirement is that you just have no permanent irrigation after 2 years. So there's kind of a 2-year period where any landscaped area would get to establish itself, and after that it wouldn't require any permanent irrigation, so a sprinkler system, etc. Or you reduce the irrigation water demand by 30% using these kind of tools, kind of metering and time tools for the peak watering month. Obviously, if you have a non-vegetated surface, so if you have pavement, you're not going to exclude that in the area of landscape required to do these calculations. And according to the project team's discretion or their choice, it's about whether they include athletic field or a playground if there's vegetation in that, or a local community garden, for example, or a food growing garden. So whether you include or exclude those in the areas is up to the project team. And just to note that second option where it talks about reducing by 30%, this is that instance where it's the reduction from the baseline. So you'd need to calculate a baseline water use, and then you'd need to reduce it 30% from that. So the second prerequisite then is about the correlating indoor water use reduction. Again, that's a simple intent. The requirement is to reduce the water use by 20% from the baseline. Again, that baseline is calculated using tables given in the manual. So for a given number of toilets or whatever fixtures or fittings you would have, you'd calculate the baseline water consumption. There's a table to enable you to do that, and from there you'd need to reduce that total by 20%. So all new toilets, urinals, restroom taps or faucets, American, kitchen sinks, they need to be water sense labelled or whatever national local equivalent, and that's just like for example, aerated taps and things like that that have water efficiency measures built in. So they'd need to have, it's like a stamp, like a CE mark, it's just another label for certain appliances. And then there's also minimum water efficiency requirements for appliances and equipment such as clothes washers or dishwashers or pre-rinse spray valves or ice machines, and any processes like heat rejection units or cooling towers or evaporative condensers. So any kind of big units or process units that are involved in that need water for their operation, essentially. So the third prerequisite is to do with water metering at the building level. So you are metering the water usage that's coming into the building at that level only. So it's kind of all the potable water coming in. So that's to enable you to detect water leaks, to measure your overall usage. And it's thought, or it's it's kind of been researched that if you can meter a building, that the overall building water consumption can be reduced by between 30 and 40%. So it's a sizable chunk of potentially efficient water use there. So to meet this prerequisite, you need to install those permanent water meters. So as it comes into at the building level, you need to compile the data that comes from that building level meter into a monthly and an annual summary. Now those meter readings can be manual or it can be automated, so you have different levels of sophistication of meter system there. And you need to also commit to sharing that data with the US Green Building Council for a 5-year period, either on the date the project accepts the LEED certification or gets it granted, or on the first day of typical occupancy or occupation of the building. So when it's pretty much operating as it will usually, so you can get an idea of the actual average water use, whichever of those comes first. And you need to commit to do that for 5 years or until the building changes ownership or leasee. So the first credit where you can actually earn points is back to the outdoor water use reduction. So it's very similar language to the prerequisite. So the prerequisite also required no permanent irrigation after 2 years. But the difference here is where the prerequisite baseline was 30%. To actually get points, you either reduce the water demand by 50 to get 1 point or 100% to get 2 points. It's the same way that you go about that. It's just the thresholds are different to get points. So the prerequisites, you have to do 30. If you want 1 point, you do 50. And if you want 2 points, you do 100%. And if you want to, you can use non-potable water sources to achieve those thresholds. So to replace the potable water with non-potable. So it's not that you're totally reducing the use of water, that you're actually reducing the irrigation potable water demand. So the second credit to do is back to indoor water use reduction, where you can get between 1 and 6 points. This is about further reducing beyond the prerequisite level, similar to the outdoor water use. So the indoor water use prerequisite looked at a 20% reduction, whereas now if you go between 25 to 50% reduction from the baseline, you get an equivalent number of from 1 to 6 points is shown in the table. And to do this, you really do need to consider those alternative sources. So you might look at rainwater harvesting, condensate, and also then you need to meet additional water efficiency measures, and that's to do with where you have them, to do with commercial washing machines or kitchen equipment or lab and medical equipment or municipal steam systems. And the manual has tables which go through kind of the requirements for each of those appliances or types of appliances and what points are available then. Other ways to kind of meet the appliance one might be having a compostable toilet or waterless features, waterless urinals, or ultra low flow urinals, or aerator taps as mentioned, or ultra low flow toilets or dual flush, etc. So there's lots of kind of different systems and appliances out there that will help you to meet the indoor, to the reduction of indoor water consumption requirement. And then the third credit is about cooling tower water use. This is quite a specific water use category or credit within this. So it's looking at water that's used for industrial purposes or kind of big systems in buildings. The idea is that you conserve the water for the cooling tower, and while also controlling microbes or corrosion and scale in the system. So not only are you conserving water, but you're also ensuring that there is no risk of disease or ill health. And this is where you might have heard of things like Legionellas, etc. So whether you're using a closed loop system, so where you're not putting in fresh water all the time, you just need to keep an eye on those aspects to make sure that you're not creating a bad health situation. So the requirement to meet the credit is that you need to do a one-time potable water analysis, and you need to measure at least 5 of the control parameters given in the table in the manual, and this is them. So it's CA, and there's max threshold levels then, so 1,000 parts per million, etc. Measures alkalinity, SiO2, CI, and conductivity. The other requirement that you need to do is to calculate the number of cooling tower cycles and limit them to avoid exceeding the maximum concentrations of any of those parameters. So if you get up to a maximum of 10 cycles that you can achieve without exceeding any of those levels or affecting the operation of the system, then you get 1 point. Whereas if you can do more than 10 cycles in the same way, or that you can meet the minimum number of cycles using a minimum of 20% recycled or reclaimed water use, then you get 2 points. So it's a quite specific credit depending on whether you'd have this system in your building. It's just worth pointing out that, and this is again just to note this difference between what's a prerequisite credit and what's just one under that particular category. So we might be thinking, well, what if my building doesn't have a cooling tower? You just can't go for those credits or get points under that. So it's not that you have to do those things under that credit category under the water category. It's if you don't have a cooling tower, you can't go for those points. And that goes back to the scorecard, the kind of sample scorecard for this. And that's the kind of thing you do as a design team as you go through kind of analysing, okay, is this a credit worth going after or not? So if you're not going to have a cooling tower, then it straight up gets that N. It's not likely, it's not possible under this condition, so we're not going to even try to go for those points that are available for that credit. So it's just a distinction to worth noting. The fourth and final credit here is then back to water metering, and then this again builds on the prerequisite here. So at the prerequisite metering level, we were looking at just metering the overall building supply, whereas now in this credit you're looking at installing additional metering for 2 or more of the typical systems. So that might be the irrigation system, the plumbing system, the domestic hot water, the boiler system, any reclaimed water, or the other processed water. So that's processed water might be to do with the cooling tower or other energy cooling systems, etc. So if you put on sub-meters essentially on two of those to kind of further track and monitor usage, then you get 1 point. And that's the fifth lecture on the water efficiency category complete.